So spreadsheet commands all start with an equals sign. So if you see an equals in front of it, means that there's going to be some kind of calculation or some kind of a function. So you'll notice that these cells all start with an equals sign. So equals sum, and it's going to take the sum of these three values and then take that and divide it by 34. That's what that's going to say. This is going to take the contents of cell D7 and it's going to multiply by 45. Now it should be noticed that on this document here, what I've done is I've just put this information in text form as opposed to calculation form. So for example, if I click on this cell right here, if I click on it, up here in the function bar, you're going to see what's actually in that cell. It looks identical with the exception of this portion right there. That happens to be the apostrophe key. And what the apostrophe does, that little one right there, is it turns this into into text. So it's not going to treat it as an equation. So again, I had to put that there simply so that when you display this, you will see the actual formula format. So these cells will not actually calculate anything, again, because in each case I put that apostrophe in front. So by putting the apostrophe in front of an equal sign, it turns it into text. Otherwise, if we start something with an equal sign, then it's going to mean it's going to be a mathematical process or some kind of a function. So again, just reviewing some of these formats here. First of all, we can see that these are going to be the most common commands you're going to see in the spreadsheets. So you'll recognize all these different mathematical operations, at least down to here. And then the ones following down here will explain a little bit more detail as they refer to referencing cells and working within worksheets. So looking at these first 8 here, the equal sign is again what we use to start a function. Okay, so for example here, equals A1 plus B1 plus divided by C2. What this is going to do is it's the order of operation implies that B1 divided by C2 is going to go first, and then we're going to take the quotient of that and add it to A1. So what that B1 is referring to is cell B1. Now again, in this case, it doesn't make any sense because B1 is just some text, so there's no number there. C2 is actually self-referential, which is referring to this cell. So this doesn't make sense in terms of this particular worksheet because again, we're just trying to show format. Now, in a little bit later, we'll start to show the function, actually some functioning worksheets. So this is just, think of this as this particular sheet right here as basically a text document. In other words, one just to show you how to set things up, but none of these are going to be active. So the plus sign obviously implies addition. And so when you're adding things, you can add just numbers, okay, and just put the number in, or you can put the contents of a cell. So if I happen to know what the contents of cell B10 is, it would basically go and retrieve that information. And in this case, it's going to take it to the sum of H1 to I5. So in other words, it's going to look at this. It's going to say, okay, it's going to find cell H1. In other words, column H, row 1, and it's going to add everything up between there and the next neighboring column, I5. So it's going to go from H1 down to H5 and from I1 down to I5. So it's going to get the sum of 10 cells. Again, it'll make more sense when we can look at an active spreadsheet. Again, this one here is formatted just simply for looking at how equations are structured. Once again, that when you see an apostrophe in front of something, this is just text. It is not numeric. Nothing. There's no calculations going to be done. So subtraction behaves just as the way you would expect subtraction to do, and division and multiplication. So once again, we can incorporate functions like sum, which in this case here is going to give the sum of 3 specific cells. And so if the contents of those cells changed in any way, then this summation here will adjust accordingly. In this case, we take the sum of those three cells, we divide it by the number 34. Now, when we're talking about exponents, exponents don't display as exponents well in spreadsheets. So we use the caret. This is the caret key right here. It's the shift 6 key. So you put the shift on the numeric 6 key and you're going to get this caret. And what that refers to is an exponent. So this would read here, take the contents of E7 and cube it. In other words, raise it to the third power. So that's what this is doing right here. So whenever you see an exponent, a caret I should say, that implies an exponent or a power. And so you can have fractional exponents as well. So like if I wanted to do the square root of E7, I'd say equals E7 caret, and then I just put 1/2. And that's going to take the square root of E7. So when we refer to an argument, okay, argument is a term we use in spreadsheets, it's also used in mathematics, is basically the contents over which the function is acting. So the function acts on the argument. So right here, if I say, okay, well, everything within the parentheses is going to be the argument. So I'll say equals the sum of G2 and G3, which is the first argument, divided by the product of 2 times the contents of F3 squared. That's the second argument. So the first argument here is going to be divided by the second argument. So just as in algebra, the parentheses work to establish the order of operations so that you get the desired value. Now, from row 9 here down, we have terms, or I should say, symbols which are used to define specific types of syntax or functions. So when you see the double quotes right here, this is going to be used to identify a range, okay? So a range means a contiguous series. So for example, if I said the sum of quote J4 to J12 quote, what we're talking about is that the range here means everything started with J4 and then go J5, 6, 7, all the way up to J12. And so it's defining a range of cells. And this will be, you can see here on this one, here it says import range. We're also using the quotes here to identify the actual file. So the quote can be used to identify a file. So it's used to identify a file, or it can be used to identify a range. So this case is being used to identify a specific file, which happens to be another spreadsheet file. This case is used to define a range. Now, when you see the exclamation point, that's used to define a worksheet within a spreadsheet. So this whole thing here is a spreadsheet which has a number of worksheets. There's functions, there's commands, there's translate. These are all various different types of worksheets within the spreadsheet. So right now we're on the functions worksheet. Now, if I'm referring to a specific worksheet within a spreadsheet, in other words, a specific tab, then I'm going to have to identify it as such with an exclamation point. So if you look up right here, this is referring to going to a specific spreadsheet and pulling up the worksheet, which is sheet number 1. And then the exclamation point means that this section from equals through sheet 1 is saying go and pick sheet 1 from that spreadsheet. So you can refer to other spreadsheets. You can refer to any spreadsheet that anybody owns so long as you know the code for that particular spreadsheet, in other words, the Uniform Resource Locator, the URL, and have permission granted to be able to see it. So again here, that we see the quotes being used to delimit the file name. There's the file name and the sheet name, in other words, the worksheet within that. We can see the quotes over here used to define a range. And so the comma, the question is, what does the comma mean? Well, the comma is delimiting or separating items in an argument. So just as you're writing a sentence, a comma does the same thing. That has the same type of syntactical function in terms of programming, whether you're doing a spreadsheet or generally writing code for in some particular programming language. So if we use the import range command again here, you'll notice over here that I've highlighted in red indicating the function right there. That's going to be the an example of where you use a comma. In other words, it's separating the file name, which is everything you see here in blue between those two black quotes, from the range. So R1 to R5 is the range within this particular spreadsheet and that particular worksheet within that spreadsheet. So we're going to go to this spreadsheet, open up that worksheet. We know it's a worksheet because there's an exclamation point. And so it goes specifically to a specific worksheet within a spreadsheet, and then it imports the range. In other words, it's going to take the contents of those cells. So the colon is, again, the syntactical unit which is used to represent a range. So like we might say, use a dash oftentimes. Like if I want to say, letters A dash Z, that means everything from A to Z. Well, we can't use a dash here because a dash means is the term we use for subtraction. So instead we use a colon. So the colon is used to represent a range. So A20 to A30, again, put in red here to indicate that that's how the syntax would apply. In other words, syntax refers to the rule of, you might say, the grammar of the code. And so that would be appropriate use of it. So now the $sign, yes, it can mean actually what you think it means, a $sign. But when it's used in conjunction with a cell, then it's going to refer to an absolute reference. So for example, there's three references here. The first one says $C, $4. That means regardless of what else happens, you're always going to go to column C and always to row 4 within column C. In other words, it's referring to a specific cell, always the same location. So if you add more rows or more columns, it's going to find what's currently C4. It's not going to adapt to any changes. So we refer to it as an absolute reference. It means always go to that cell. In this syntax over here, we're saying always go to column D, but we don't always have to go to number 5. So if we were to copy this, then it'll keep track of where 5 is, and it can do a relative copy to 6, 7, 8, 9, and so forth. And so this is going to be absolute with respect to D, relative with respect to 5. So in other words, that we're always picking up the column D, but the row number is going to increment as necessary. Here's just the reverse, where the column is relative, and so if it's copied over, it'll say, oh, you copied from G colon 9 or $9, and let's say you put it into Z. Well, it'll change from G to Z because it assumes you're using a general formula and it wants to copy it in a relative fashion, but it'll always pick up row 9. So whatever Z9 is, then it would apply. So the $sign is again used to mean an absolute reference. Without the $sign, it's going to be a relative reference. Most of the spreadsheets you're going to encounter initially are going to just be relative, and that's because we can copy them easier. But particularly if we're going to do some kind of a calculation where we have a fixed value, so for example, like let's say a constant, and we put that constant on the spreadsheet someplace, then we would refer specifically always to that cell. But of course, we need to make sure we don't enter any rows or columns ahead of it, or that will throw off the reference. Okay, so the apostrophe, as we've described before, is used to treat the contents as text rather than numbers. So if I put the apostrophe there, then equals no longer means put in an equation. It's going to say, it's going to mean, oh, this is just text. In other words, equals doesn't really mean mathematically equals for the purpose of calculations, just means visually. So again, as humans, we look at the equals and we know what that means, and we will apply that as an equation no matter how we see it. But here it's referred to as just text. Those just happen to be two parallel lines, and that's just for reference. That's not going to do any mathematical function. So again, this whole thing is a spreadsheet. And when we look down here, these are worksheets. So if I click on the commands worksheet, these will be the most common commands that you're going to see in a spreadsheet, or at least in terms of the stuff we would do in teaching sciences. So I've scrolled down here and I've put in about 18 of these. You can see the header row is right there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that row 1, and I'm going to say View, Show, Freeze One Row. And what that is now as I scroll forward, you can see that the headers stay put. And these headers here stay in the same location. Now I can do the same for column 1. So if I go to View, I'll say I'd like to freeze up to the first column. And now I can scroll to the right and notice that the header column A, stays fixed. And so the way you set up things like for a database is to freeze the headers, whether they happen to be a header row, as in case row 1, or a header column in the case of column A. Now, so these are the functions right here, and we will use those functions in various different places in terms of our spreadsheet. Let's just go ahead and just give you a synopsis of what those means, and we'll actually do that in the next video.